Hello, I'm going to show you my bread recipe today. When I first started becoming interested in making bread, I was looking for a way to make bread and that was cheap, it's simple, didn't require any special equipment or any special skills, and I really felt like that wasn't too much to ask because people have been making bread for thousands of years throughout human history, and it's the base unit of human food. You know, it's the staple of human food. So I felt that you should be able to make it, and it shouldn't take hundreds of dollars worth of equipment or fancy complex ingredients or a bread maker or any special skills. And I think I've done a pretty good job here of coming up with a recipe that it's almost foolproof. It will surprise you sometimes. But I'm going to show you how I make it. So I'm starting out with 3 cups of flour. And I'm going to put 3 cups of flour into this mixing bowl, roughly 3 cups. Honestly, I eyeball this stuff every time, and the recipe comes out a little bit different every time. So, there we go. If you're a little bit off in flour or a little bit off in water, this particular recipe is going to be really forgiving. And now I'm going to get some water. I am actually going to temp check this water. You don't have to do that. Just lukewarm will be fine. If the water's not exactly the perfect temperature, all that's going to happen is it's going to take a little bit longer for the yeast to activate. But I'll show you exactly how I do it when I make this recipe. So your ingredients, though, it's going to be flour, water, salt, yeast. And then I do use a little bit of sugar, or sometimes I use honey. Or you could use, anything with sugar in it. Maple syrup would work too. Just a little bit of that with the yeast and the water, so that the yeast have something to feed on while they're activating. Okay, so I'm going to take 2 ounces of water roughly. It's probably more than you need, but that's conveniently marked on my jar. My water gets really hot really fast. Okay, so there's 2 ounces of water. That's 99 degrees, roughly, in temperature. So I'm going to take my yeast packet. I like that Red Star yeast too. I don't use, I have these packs of this Platinum instant yeast. I don't use that. I just use Active Dry. The kind that you do have to activate. Okay, so we're going to mix those together. You'll see those little kernels of dehydrated yeast. When they start to mix with the water, they'll swell up and get like oatmeal-y. Just stir it until they, until they look kind of like a porridge, like a thin porridge. Make sure the sugar is dissolved. It's not really an exact science. Don't stress about this part. Just mix these 2 together. I guess you can't see it that way. Here we go, mix those 2 together until you get something like that. I think it looks more like the water from oatmeal than oatmeal. It smells good though. Boy, you can see it bubbling immediately. I know you can't see it, but yeah, it starts bubbling immediately. And then let that sit. It was at approximately the 2 ounce mark, and then you'll see it start to foam up towards the 4 ounce mark. And that's how we'll know the yeast is ready to go. So in the meantime, let's combine the dry ingredients. 2 teaspoons of salt. Again, more or less 2 teaspoons of salt. You use whatever you want. I'm using non-iodized sea salt. Sometimes I use that pink salt. You can use pretty much whatever you want though. Okay, so the salt and the flour. I like to mix the salt into the flour while it's dry. That way you get a good dispersion of the salt into the flour. And that might just be me being paranoid, but otherwise I think, what if all the salt gets into like one part of it? It's a lot harder to mix once it's wet. So what if all the salt winds up in one part of the bread? And the salt's important. It's important to taste. It also affects how the yeast is going to interact with the bread. So yeah, that's important. Now here we're using 3 cups of water. I'm sorry, we're using 3 cups of flour. 3 cups of flour, 1.5 cups of water. So this is by volume, not by weight. It's 3 cups of flour, 1.5 cups of water. So I've got 10 ounces of warm water here, just lukewarm water, and then 2 ounces of water in here. Put them together, that's 12 ounces. I'm gonna pour that in. Now I wanted to show you guys how I do this. This is a no-knead recipe. It really is the simplest recipe that I have at my disposal. I've got those ingredients in there. I'm going to mix them together. This is a stainless steel mixing bowl. It is for a stand mixer, but I'm not going to use a stand mixer. When you mix this together, you'll start to see like a rough dough forming. This is going to be a pretty well hydrated dough by the time we're done. A lot of times I will mix the yeast into the water before I mix it into the dough to get you a good dispersion of the yeast into the dough. But over time, I just haven't been too worried about that. Haven't had any problems with that. Okay, I got that started. That's activating. And then I'm just going to pause the camera and I'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes once that yeast is ready to be added. Okay, it's only been 3 or 4 minutes since I paused the video. And I started at just under 2 ounces in this jar. Now I'm at just under 4. And you can see all those little bubbles in the foam that yeast has turned into. Now it's kind of like a cream. And this is my bread dough so far. This is like a normal bread dough consistency. This 3 cups to 10 ounces, that's like sort of what a normal dough would be like. You can see that it pulls off the edges of the bowl pretty cleanly, and you get like a nice, like kind of manageable dough. This would be kind of like a wet dough, but still within the bounds of like a normal, make a loaf of bread out of it, conventional bread dough. When we add this extra 2 ounces into it, it's really going to hydrate it a lot. Again, I know it's 4 ounces now, but it was 2 ounces of water. The rest of it's foam and carbon dioxide from the yeast. Now I'm going to mix this together until that yeasty water incorporates with the dough. If anyone is interested in more of these, I'm going to probably just send this to people I know about, but people I know and are curious about it anyway. But if anybody's interested in this type of video, I'll make some more about other types of bread. like specifically ones where you can make like a milk bread, or you can make like a pizza dough and make a bread out of that and make a pizza out of it too. Those are delicious, and show you the difference in hydration. Sometimes with those you feel like there's not enough water to turn the flour into a dough. Like, how is this going to work? But then you keep mixing it, and then eventually all does work out. And you get a nice stiff dough that you can form and turn into a loaf that's actually going to raise and be shaped like something you'd recognize. Whether it's, you know, like a baguette or a Kaiser roll, or just like a regular loaf of bread. Like, here's one that I just made a couple days ago. Obviously I cut both ends off of it, but you can see that's more like a conventional loaf of bread. That was an experiment. It didn't turn out the way I had expected, but it was actually pretty good. Okay. But you'll see how much different this loaf of bread is when we're done. Okay, I'm going to call this mixed for now. And you see what that looks like? You kind of got to scrape it off the sides. It's not pulling off on its own. It's a very wet dough. Okay. Anyway, that's all mixed together. I'm going to scrape that dough in there. I got it off the edges of the walls of the pot that I'm using to mix in. Mostly cleaned off the spoon. Set that aside for later. Not a huge amount of dough in there. It's kind of hard to see this stuff on the camera, but there's not a huge amount of dough in there. But it's going to really expand. And what I like to do now is preheat the oven. I'm going to mix a little more in there after I pause the camera. That's fine though, the way it is. I'm going to preheat the oven to 450. Get anything that's heat sensitive off the oven. Like if you're using olive oil or any other kind of oxidating oil. Get that out of the way of the heat. But I like to preheat the oven and put this right near the vent where the heat comes out as it preheats. I take my pizza tray out of there too. And then that helps the dough rise a lot faster. So, you know, the amount of yeast you have in there, and then the temperature that it's at, and the amount of hydration you have, that's all going to directly correlate to how fast that rises. This is very hydrated. It's going to be pretty warm in a minute here. We used warm water, had really active yeast. This is going to rise pretty quickly. So I'm preheating the oven. I have that in there. I'm going to set this timer for an hour. Okay, and then we'll check back in on this later. I am actually going to stir it. You saw I poured that little bit of yeast in there. I'm just going to stir that in quick, but then it's going to look just like it looked. And that's all you have to do. So again, your ingredients here: 3 cups of flour, 1.5 cups of water. So that's 12 ounces of water. I use 2 ounces that I mix with the yeast and a little bit of sugar. And then the other 10 ounces goes right into the flour in the beginning. Then that all gets mixed together. And then we're going to let it raise for at least an hour. And that's not exact science either. Sometimes I forget about this. I don't come back for 3 hours. And then sometimes after an hour, it takes another half an hour. And all of those turn into pretty good looking loaves of bread. So this is a recipe that's harder to screw up than most. So, but we'll check back in here soon. Okay, welcome back. It's been 1 hour. Exactly, the timer just went off. And the dough is looking much, much bigger than it was before. I'm going to move the camera so you can get a good view of this without me disturbing it too much. There you go, look at that. Wow. So several times more volume than I had before. Okay. And then I preheated the oven obviously before we concluded the last video. And then I'll show you the cooking apparatus I'm going to use here. This is in the oven preheating a little bit. This is a French white. You could use a pot, you could use stoneware, you could use an oven safe bowl. Again, this is a French white, so it's a Corningware makes it. They call it a French white. There's 3 different sizes. This is the bigger one. And I'm going to use parchment paper today. I don't really use parchment paper anymore. There's a couple different ways to work around using parchment paper. But for today, I'm going to use parchment paper because if you're making your first loaf of bread, it's going to give you a much higher likelihood of having a good experience because the dough won't stick to the bowl. And that's just so frustrating. When you put all this energy in, sometimes the dough will stick. So what we're going to do is just dump this, basically. Again, it's really hydrated dough. We're going to just dump this right in here. Right on top of the parchment paper. This is preheated. Okay, we're going to just scoop this all in here. Okay. Put that into the bowl. Okay. And then I'm going to put that bowl into the hot oven. And we're going to create like a Dutch oven. Again, the goal here is to use no special and no expensive equipment. So we're going to put our French white or your pot that you're cooking in or whatever it is that you're cooking in. I'm going to put that right in there. Okay, and then I've got a plate. This is an oven safe plate. It's actually oven safe to 350, but I always use this one at 450 and I haven't had any problems. Okay. So I'm using the plate on top of the French white, just like that, like a little Dutch oven. And I am using parchment paper. Again, that's just for your first couple loaves you make. Have a good experience, have fun. It's not likely that it's going to stick to the bottom of the pan, but it does happen sometimes and it is super frustrating. There's ways to avoid it. You could season or flour the pan, or you could cook it on like a pizza tray, but you would need a different dough than this for that. Anyway, so that's in there. I'm going to set the timer for 20 minutes. I'm going to cook it for 20 minutes with the plate on top of it and then take a look at it. And then I'm going to cook it for at least another 10 minutes with the plate off of it. So I will see you guys again in 20 minutes. Okay, my 20-minute timer is up. So I've been baking the loaf of bread inside the pot with the lid on it for 20 minutes. You can experiment with the time a little bit too. I'm going to do 20 and then 10, so 20 minutes with the lid on, 10 minutes with the lid off. But I've done as much as 25 and 12. Okay. And that is looking amazing. Let me just show you without letting too much heat out. See how the crust is cracked like that? I love when it does that. Makes it look really classy. Okay, let's close that up. We're going to let it brown up for 10 minutes, maybe 12. Okay, so we'll wait 10 more minutes and then we'll see how browned up it is. You're going to want to get some kind of a cooling rack. You could even use something as simple as like an inverted muffin tray or cupcake tray and use the tops of those to set the bread on, but you want something to keep some air circulation around the bottom of the bread crust as it cools off. I'm going to use this. This is from a Rival turkey cooker and it's just the grate from that, and I'm going to use that as my cooling rack. It's very hot. Obviously, careful, everything's hot. And then we'll see in 10 minutes if this is ready to go. Okay, so that was 10 minutes with the lid off. The lid, by the way, is important because it keeps the top of the bread from crusting over too quickly, and it lets it expand. And you'll see you get these nice cracks in it. I'm gonna put that back in for a couple minutes. Yeah, that looks great to me. That's A+. Let me put it in for 2 more minutes. 2 or 3 more minutes. Oh, that's hot. And then we'll see what it looks like. Should be great. If you don't have a lid, like if you don't have an oven-safe plate, what you can do as an alternative is you could take a pot of water and put it in the oven, and that'll create like some steam, or at least some extra moisture inside the oven. I guess not steam, but it'll keep the humidity higher, and that'll have the same effect. It'll allow the bread to expand as it cooks for the first 15-20 minutes. And then you can pull that out, let it dry out, and it'll crisp up the crust. You get a nice crunchy crust and that nice golden brown color that everybody's looking for in their bread. Okay, so in a couple minutes I'll be right back. Okay, so it has been 3 minutes. So 2 minutes, I'm sorry. So it was 20 minutes with the lid on and a little over 12 minutes with the lid off. And I'm pretty happy with how this bread looks. So I'm just gonna go ahead and call it. The parchment paper has like a weird effect on the dough, so it gives it kind of a weird shape. Sometimes you have to make sure you get all the parchment paper off the dough. That's why I don't always use the parchment paper. But seriously though, I recommend it in the beginning, especially, just so you have a good experience and get dough that you can eat. You don't wind up having half of your loaf glued to the bottom of the pan. Oh gosh. Okay. Let me show you what we got here. I think this looks awesome. Again, it's a little funky because you have these lines here from the parchment paper. But it doesn't look like we have any parchment paper stuck in there, so that's good. If I do another video, I'll show you how. It's really easy. I mean, you can look up how to season a pan. But listen to this. Hear that? Like somebody's knocking on the door. That's what we're looking for. Hearth loaf, that's what I would call it. Just an old-fashioned loaf of bread. Looks fantastic with that crust. I'm gonna let it cool down for a while, then I'll cut it open, and I'll probably add a couple pictures of what it looks like on the inside. Yeah, real happy with that one. So that's kind of what I would expect it to look like. Without the parchment paper, it would be, just a little more perfectly circular around the diameter of it, around the diameter of the loaf. But yeah, real happy with that. So I'm going to cut the video off there. I'll probably do another one later where I can show you, a knead recipe and some of the different things you can do with that kind of dough.